made another pass, and I was standing right about here, and I could look right in the cockpit and just see him with the leather jacket. And he come in and he made a nice landing. Landed on the carrot field, and he ended up in the hay field, which was up towards the wood. And successful landing, and that's pretty tricky. But at the time, we only had Police Chief Tom Croswell on the payroll or full-time, and Fire Chief was Harold Conran. And they come down, because somebody must have called up, and they were kind of giving him the double. This was Chester. He says, look, I had mechanical trouble, and I could have been killed. But it was, I was surprised. I could look right in the cockpit as he come right in between my mother's house and this. Yeah, he a nice landing. Now, what he had a rented, it was a rented plane, and 2 or 3 days later, I saw people come in that owned the plane, and they had to take the wing off because you couldn't trailer it down the road, you'd wipe everything out, you know. So they took the wing off and they towed the plane back to wherever the airport was. But that was, it was interesting to see that. Say he had a lot of guts to tow it. Okay, that's the end of that little story, I think. Now, another fellow I'd like to talk about that Harold Norwood. He had the Norwood brand sheep manure. Now, in the woolen mills in the Merrimack Valley and elsewhere, they used tons and tons of wool, and they'd get all the good wool out of it that they could. Some of it was encrusted with manure. And Harold was smart enough, you know, after the Depression and everything, he'd go, and he had a nice red Rio truck, I can remember, a platform truck, and he'd go up and get paid for cleaning out the wool that they couldn't use, and then he brought it back, and he had a building, well, from Oakdale Road, it was in between Oakdale Road and, say, the west driveway to the high school. There's a little road, there's a Sheridan Drive, a Sheridan Road. It was just a dirt little road, and it's set back in. And it was a building. It didn't. I stopped there. I was working for Eddie and Rob Wheeler at the time, and they wanted to see Harold Norwood for a few minutes. And that's the only time I saw it. But the building had a cement floor, and he could drive or back his red Rio truck in. And he had some young fellows, Mooney Croswell, I don't know if anybody remembers the Mooney. Yeah. Tommy Croswell, he was a grandson of Tom Croswell, the chief. And his father was Kate Croswell, he worked for the Reading Power Company. And he lived very near there, where the Duval was a house, where the Duval roofing is now. But anyhow, and a couple of the Mahan boys were working there. And what they had about 3 by 5 coarse screens set up at an angle. And they had to fork that wool with the manure on it. It was dry, but they put it on and they'd grate it. And they'd ended up with a nice, really nice granulated fertilizer. And he'd bag it up, and he had it on his bag, 50-pound bags. They were paper bags. It was Norwood brand, and he'd have the nitrogen value and everything in it. Now, and when he got a load, he'd go from here, and he'd stop at hardware stores, early garden centers, and till he got rid of the load. Eddie Wheeler said he went as far as New Jersey. A lot of times, he had his wife in the cab, a big shaggy dog, sleepy in it. He was a nice guy. And, sometimes, a fellow that worked at some of the farms, David Walker. He might be riding on back to help him unload it. But anyway, I thought it was quite good that somebody was getting something that was being thrown out, and he made a living out of it. And he lived, at the time, at the end of it, he lived in a house over Mount Vernon Street, about where Bobby knows where he lives. I don't know if the house is torn down or what. But he died in 1951. He's buried in the Veterans. He was a World War I veteran. He died, he was 56, he died, and he's buried down in Riverside Cemetery. But I thought it was quite an idea to do, because people had to do things to make a living. That's the end of my story, I guess. I don't know if they rolled streets then, but they did years ago. This is way back. They used them for sleds and the bus. The worst of it was going down the hill. They had to, roll into the
house was still yellow when we were kids, right?
But this is where Pleasant Street was.
Yeah.
All right.
Very nice.
Good evening. Good evening. I'd just like to talk to you about my grandfather, whose name was Alfred Danforth. You see where I get my name. And he was the head painter at McLean's wagon factory. You know, they used to have a big wagon factory before it burned about the time I was born. And it was quite a business, I guess, probably one of the biggest business in town. And so before that, in the days back then, they didn't have trade schools. So if you wanted a special, you know, highly skilled job, you'd have to go an apprentice. And so he went out and apprenticed at Acton, Mass, which is near Concord, you know. And that, as he grew older, of course he probably stayed there till he was in his 20s, early 20s. He met my grandmother because she was a teacher there. She used to go by his shop where he painted, you know, for the old fellow that apprenticed him. And then finally he came to McLean's, and he got a job there. So he was the head painter. And I heard Tom Croswell's name mentioned, and Tom Croswell, as a young man, worked for him in the paint shop. So, the connection. They used to do big beer wagons for Boston, the big breweries in Boston, and they used to do the milk and course delivery wagons, and in those days they had, you know, they'd have like little taxis going around with wagons, and so it was. So Mr. McLean died in 1917, and I heard that before that, he offered to have the town named McLean if they'd take $10,000. He died in 1917. He was coming back from Florida, I believe, on the train, and he had a heart attack or stroke or something and passed away. So my grandfather finally, he worked all his life in a paint shop, and of course in those days they didn't have good air circulation, but even with good air circulation, I understand that eventually it affects your brain. Fumes are just too much for your body to handle. And so he, in his late 50s, he started to have strokes. And just prior to this, I saw on Channel 2, they have these experts on, you know, they had a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist said, he'd put a normal brain up, you know, they do these MRIs, and he put a normal brain up, and then he put somebody that, you know, had some problem, and you could see very clearly what was wrong, you know. And with the fumes, you know, ingesting these wrong fumes all the time, you'd see the brain change. It was quite a change in it. So that, and my grandmother always used to say about him, it was because he was in those fumes all the time. That's why he's having all these strokes. And she was right. So, I guess that's about it.
Thank you very much. I think that was very interesting.
Thank you. Very nice.
Very nice.
Thank you. Thank you very much.